This video is sponsored by Squarespace. 2 weeks ago, I set out to build the most elaborate dungeon build I've ever attempted for use in my D&D campaign, as well as a variety of miniature skirmish games. I built it mainly out of foam and balsa wood, but left specific sized alcoves built into the board to house a series of modular dungeon tiles within it, so that the dungeon layout can be a little bit different every time I use it. In this week's video, we are finally going to paint this massive dungeon board, build a bunch of scratch-built furniture to help flesh it out, as well as adding some other fun details and painting every monster and NPC we need to run the first basement layer of Death House from the D&D adventure Curse of Strahd, which is what the basic layout for this dungeon build is based on. And with all of that out of the way, let's get started. To start out, we're going to remove all the dungeon tiles and just focus on getting this big chunky foam board painted. And as we've already sealed this board with a thick coat of Mod Podge and acrylic black craft paint, any sort of water-based paints should work fine over top of this. I started out by sponging on this navy blue base coat onto the whole board, making sure to leave some of the black primer in the recesses for shadows. And while you might be thinking this is a bit of a bright base color to choose for a dungeon, just bear with me, as we're going for a dungeon look here that is inspired by the environments from one of my favorite video games of all time, Hollow Knight, which uses a lot of blues and violets to create some amazing underground environments. For some of the more hard to reach areas, I used a wide brush and a sponging motion instead of an actual sponge, and once I felt like the entire board had been given a pretty solid base coat of the Space Marine blue color, I moved on to highlights. For our first pass of highlights, I sponged on a light lavender color, hitting just the most raised areas of the stone. In areas where I went a bit too far with the highlights, I used my sponge to blend the blue and the purple together, and my main focus at this stage is not to create perfectly blended highlights, but instead to just nail those really high highlights so they can be blended down later. With the main highlights nailed down, I then sponged on a bit of this bright teal color in a few places for a higher highlight, as well as some variety to the colors. And finally, I dry brushed the entire board with an off-white color to bring out some of the texture and details. And with the main board mostly painted, it was time to move on to the dungeon tiles. As I explained in our previous video, we are basically using two sets of dungeon tiles here. The first set is from the Dungeons and Lasers City of Absalom kit that we painted in the first video in this series, and the second set, which we will be painting today, is the new half-height Dwarven Mine kit, which was sent to us by Dungeons and Lasers specifically to help with this build. So once again, huge thanks to Dungeons and Lasers for sending over all these dungeon tiles. Link down in the description if you want to see the specific kits we are using here. And I've decided to use a similar technique to paint these that we used to paint the first set of tiles. I primed them all first in Pro-Acryl Brown Black, and I then gave them an overspray with white primer to highlight all of the details. For the stone floor tiles, I then gave them a spray of Army Painter's Speed Paint, Tyrian Navy, spraying not from above, but from each side of the tile to help preserve and heighten the shadows and highlights. After this, I gave them all a second spray with Purple Swarm to help them match the more indigo color of the main board and to just give them a bit of color variety. Once this was done, I used the same wood color that I used for the house tiles from the previous video to paint all of the wooden parts of the walls and the doors so that they would match the first set of tiles. And then I went in and painted all of these stone parts on these walls by hand using the same colors that I sprayed onto the floor tiles. And with all of the main terrain painting complete, it was time to move on to the furniture. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about this video's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I have been using for over a decade now for all of my website needs. You just pick from one of their beautifully designed website templates, add in any extra pages you might want, and then customize things to your heart's content using their incredibly intuitive drag and drop grid system. No coding or technical knowledge required. I've been using my own personal Squarespace website for almost 2 years now to host a gallery of my painted miniatures, all of my painting reference documents, as well as an online store where I can sell anything that I might want. So if you need a website, make sure to go and check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howell for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now, let's build some furniture. There are a few main pieces of furniture that I'd like to build for this dungeon, but by far the most numerous thing I will have to create if I want this dungeon to be consistent with its source material is a lot of beds. The cultist quarters at the bottom of the dungeon require 5 smaller beds, the master bedroom requires 1 large bed, and we also need 4 rough-looking mattresses for the cultist quarters on the 2nd level. As I'd already made a few beds for the first video in this series, I decided to reuse a few of those, as well as making a few more to match using the same method. I used the queen-size bed for the master bedroom that I'd already built, and 2 of the twin beds for the fancier cultist rooms. I then made 3 more of these twin beds using the same method as the originals. And that method is carving a mattress and pillows out of insulation foam, cutting bedposts out of balsa wood, and then gluing all of this together using hot glue. After this, I used a 50-50 mix of Mod Podge and water to create a sort of paper mache mixture, and then dipped some paper towels into that mixture to create and glue down sheets for the beds. For the more rough-looking smaller beds in the cultist initiate quarters, I used the same method but made the beds a little bit smaller and skipped giving these ones bedposts as described in the module. These are just supposed to be mattresses on the floor. I also made the sheets on these ones look a little bit more disheveled, but used the same method as the other ones. With the beds all complete, it was now time to move on to another kind of bed, the coffins for the crypt section of this board. And as per the adventure module, we are going to need 6 coffins for this, 1 for each of the tombs. I started by carving a rough coffin shape for each one out of foam, and I then carefully carved the impression of a lid into the sides of each coffin. I glued each one to a bit of tiled styrene that I had, and this helped give each one of these coffins a little bit more weight and created a little raised dais for each coffin to sit on. And after that, I called these done. We're gonna paint all of the beds and these furniture pieces all in one batch later, by the way. There were also a few tables needed for this dungeon, as well as a few chairs, and I made these in the simplest way possible, just cutting tabletops out of large popsicle sticks and gluing on balsa wood sticks for table legs. For the chairs for these tables, I just used some of my existing plastic miniature chairs that I already owned and painted from various plastic kits, but if you have a lot of patience, you could make chairs out of popsicle sticks and balsa wood too, but I think that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. Finally, let's talk about the well. There is a water well in the bottom of this dungeon in the middle of the room between all of the fancy cultists' quarters. And here is how I made that. I started by carving a rough cylinder the shape of a water well from polystyrene and then cutting a hole inside of it. After this, I carved some alcoves for some balsa wood posts, glued them inside using hot glue, and topped it all off with another piece of balsa wood to give it that classic water well look. I then carved individual bricks into the outside of the well, capped off the bottom with a piece of cardboard, and called it done. For painting all of the furniture, I primed everything in our mixture of Mod Podge and black paint, and I used basic acrylic paints to paint on all the colors that I needed, with the exception of all of the wood pieces, which I left as raw wood, and then I just stained these with some speed paint. Miniatures. The miniatures needed to run this dungeon as the first basement level of Death House in Curse of Strahd are 5 shadows, 4 ghouls, 2 ghasts, 1 mimic, and 1 grick. As per Mandy Mod's suggestion, link in the description to Mandy Mod's guide for Curse of Strahd, I removed the grick from this adventure as I felt like it doesn't really suit the dungeon, and this dungeon is difficult enough already without a grick. For the 5 shadows, I just used Nighthaunt Chainghast minis I had lying around, and for the ghouls, I happen to have 4 metal ghoul miniatures in my Chainmail Miniatures game collection, and I thought this would be a great time to paint those. For the mimic, this mimic is supposed to be a door, so I thought this piece from my bits collection, I think this might be part of a Dungeons and Lasers mimic bed miniature from one of their accessory sprues. I thought this would work great as a base for making a mimic door, so I glued that to a base, and I'm going to add some stuff to it as I paint it to make it look less like a bed and more like a door. For the 2 ghasts, these are supposed to be Mr. and Mrs. Durst, so if you watched my first episode in this series, you'll already know I've decided on a different fate for Mr. Durst, and we've already made a miniature for him in episode 1 of this series. So today, we just need to make a single ghast here for Mrs. Durst. And because Mrs. Durst is kind of one of the big villains of the module, I wanted to give her a miniature that was a bit special and unique. As part of my larger Curse of Strahd project, I've already bought a few miniatures ahead of time, and one of the things that I bought early on was a ton of 3D printed villager minis sculpted by Titan Troll and printed by Ott's Workshop on Etsy. I didn't have any particular plan for this specific villager mini, and I thought she really embodied the vibe of Mrs. Durst, even though a ghast doesn't typically look like this, so that's what we're going to use, and these are our minis. I assembled them all, based them all, giving each one some flagstones using that same polystyrene sheet of tiles that I used before for the coffins, and then I added on some of our basing paste like we used in the previous few videos. I then primed all the miniatures in black, gave the mimic a spray of magenta, followed up with some more hot glue on top of the mimic, which I then sprayed in magenta to create this sort of magenta ooze type of creature. I then sprayed the remaining miniatures in purple, followed up by an overspray in white, with the exception of the shadows, which I left purple, but sprayed just the bases in white so they would match all the other bases. With all of the airbrushing done, I then painted all of these miniatures pretty quickly using mostly speed paints, and that's really about it. Here is some footage of me painting them if you're curious. Putting the whole thing together and seeing it with the furniture and the miniatures, I'm pretty happy with the final result, but there still might be a few details I would like to add in the future, such as the statue in the shrine room, some more wooden scaffolding and painting details, and of course the dungeon layer directly below this one, which I would like to build at some point. But that's about it for today. As always, if you want to see this dungeon in action, go and check out our brand new RPG actual play channel, Howling Elf, where we will be uploading episodes of our new Curse of Strahd campaign very, very soon. Sorry, this was a bit of a busy month. We don't have any episodes up there yet. Thank you, as always, to all of our wonderful patrons for your ongoing support, and I will see you all in the next video.